Our next presentation is by Rich Valdez from SWCA, and his topic is the role of restored floodplains in conservation of the endangered Rio Grande Silvery minnow.
Okay, thank you. Well, first of all, I want to thank Debbie Lee and her staff, and then of course Catherine for organizing this science symposium. It was a good symposium last year, and we appreciate the effort that you've made, that West has made, despite the COVID and all the other issues that we've got here. I think this is a good opportunity for people to get together and talk about these issues. So thank you very much for organizing this. This presentation is about the role of restored floodplains and conservation of the endangered Rio Grande Silvery minnow. I want to thank my co-authors and colleagues, Grace Haggerty and Steve Zipper. Grace is, of course, the Bureau Chief for the New Mexico Interstate Stream Commission, and Steve is the head biologist for the Rio Grande out of SWCA in Albuquerque. To start out, just as a quick chronology to kind of set the context, the Middle Rio Grande program, of course, was established in 2003. There were two biological opinions issued by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, one in 2003 and one in 2016. The one in 2003 was critical because it basically called for the programs to put together a, it recognized the need for floodplains and riparian areas. And in that 2003 biological opinion, it directed the federal agencies to conduct habitat and ecosystem restoration in the Middle Rio Grande to benefit the various species, but especially the Rio Grande Silvery minnow. And so in response to that, the collaborative program in 2003 started a restoration program. And since that time, there's been about 1,600 acres of habitat that have been restored under a water depletion neutral framework that's been mostly mechanical modification of bank lines and islands and old floodplains, so that these floodplains will connect with the main river and inundate at flows lower than we might otherwise see. In 2008, the New Mexico Interstate Stream Commission, under the guidance of Grace Haggerty, initiated a series of studies on these restored floodplains and compared them with natural floodplains and others. And I'm going to go through this. This will be the topic of much of this discussion. And then in 2016, we had a new biological opinion that reiterated that need for floodplain habitat and the importance of that habitat. And so with that, just a little bit of a view of some of the habitat restoration. You see an amphibious caterpillar, the terracing the bank lines. There were different techniques that were used, terracing and also excavation of low-lying areas. There were about 10 program partners that were involved in the construction of these sites, some 300 sites or so. And they're designed, like I said, to inundate at flows down to about 500 CFS. Most inundate at about 1,500 and over, depending on the area and the reach. And they basically look somewhat like this that you see in that lower left photograph, and I'll talk about that more in a bit. Aerial photographs of these restored floodplain sites in 2016, photos courtesy of Todd Kaplan Geosystems. You can see some of the areas were vegetated in that photo on the left. You see the inundation kind of creating these shallow areas that the fish really like, and of course it also benefits the riparian habitat. Same with the center photo, and especially one on the right. You can see that they're not necessarily deepened pool type habitats, but they're more scalloped type habitats that allow for inundation at different flows, but then also various depths that are really critical to what the silvery minnow need. And so with the 2016 biological opinion, that opinion identified fundamentally two production strategies. and I'm referring to the slide on the left here. A production strategy identified two management strategies, for the silvery minnow, a production strategy and a survival strategy. The production strategy refers to the period during high spring runoff, and it basically refers to the production of the silvery minnow during that time. The survival strategy refers to that period that is during the low flow periods in the summertime when the flow may be low or intermittent, or perhaps the river may dry in some areas. That biological opinion contains an entire appendix that deals with this relationship that I show on the lower right figure, which is a relationship between the catch per unit effort of the silvery minnow and different various aspects of flow in the river. And we see pretty consistently a relationship between high October CPUE, that's the October census CPUE, and high flows. We think that there is a mechanism behind this relationship that needs to be further explored, and that's what we've been doing in these floodplains recently. So that our hypothesis is that the positive relationship that we see for this October CPUE between high spring flow and Rio Grande silvery minnow density is related to floodplain inundation and survival of the larvae, and that's the real key. I'll be giving another presentation about the same time tomorrow, where I'll be talking more specifically about the residence time of the larval Rio Grande silvery minnow in these floodplains. So if we look at the information that we've gotten from floodplains, and I want to only show you 2 years, 2016 on the left and 2017 on the right. The figures across the top are FIKE net catches. You see FIKE at the top of each one of these for 2016, 2017. And then the figures along the bottom are for larvae, and those are with dip nets. We're finding that there are a number of species of fish that use these restored floodplains, and also we're looking and comparing with natural floodplains. And we're not seeing a real difference between the restored floodplains and the natural floodplains. They seem to be functioning very similar to natural floodplains. We found in 2016 that about 19%, almost 20% of the fish in the floodplains, and this is in the springtime, of course, were silvery minnow, and about 16% in 2017. And that's out of about 11 and 14 species in those 2 years, respectively. So, you know, the fish are using those. The adults are going in there. We're still trying to figure out the residence time of the adults, how long they stay, if they're spawning in the floodplain itself, which they appear to be, but they also appear to be spawning along the inundated shorelines adjacent to the floodplain. So there seems to be a flux of fish moving in and out of these floodplains, but they're certainly using them and benefiting from them. The story, though, is down here in the lower figures with what we're finding with the larvae. We're finding, we found 9 species of larvae in the floodplains in 2016, 6 species in 2017. 73% of the larvae we found in 2016 were silvery minnow, and 79%, almost 80% of the larvae in the floodplains were silvery minnow. Now, the silvery minnow does spawn early. We've seen other papers, Krabenkopf and some of these other individuals have described how silvery minnows are an early season spawner, spawning usually somewhere around 12 to 14 degrees centigrade, something like that. We're currently developing temperature models to better identify the spawning time of the fish based on this information that we're finding in these floodplains. But the bottom line is that a large part of the fish community uses these floodplains. Now, what's happening? Why are the silvery minnow going into the floodplains? Well, the one thing that you might surmise is that, you know, they use them for spawning, which evidently they do. And what I'm showing you here is for 3 categories of silvery minnow in different reproductive conditions. We have gravid females as the left bar, nuptial males as the center bar, and spent females as the right bar. The nuptial males are males that are expressing milt. And you see for 4 different studies, starting with the work that Eric Gonzalez did in 2008, 2009, that there are substantial proportions of fish that are either gravid, nuptial, or spent females. So for example, Eric in that period of time found that 40% of the silvery minnow that he handled at that time were gravid females, 27% were nuptial female or nuptial males, and 12% were spent females. And you can see that pattern generally across the board, where what we're finding in these floodplains is fish that are in reproductive condition. Like I said, they're either spawning in the floodplains or adjacent nearby shoreline areas that are inundated. So we know that the fish, we've got good evidence that the fish are actually spawning in these areas. Now, how long do they stay in the areas? We coincidentally had an opportunity to look at that, and it's in one of our reports. We haven't published this information yet. We have this information here. But Steve Zipper in 2019 was running some wagon wheel pit tag receivers down in the floodplains that are around River Mile 100. And he found that pit tag fish that had been released by Utah State University as part of a movement study for the Bureau of Reclamation. That's the folks out of Utah State University that have been doing that study for reclamation. He found that the pit tag fish were going into those floodplain areas, but they didn't seem to persist and stay in the floodplain during the whole period of inundation, which we thought was kind of curious and interesting. So that's still a little bit of a mystery as to whether silvery minnow move in and out of the floodplains, or whether they take up residence in the floodplains, or whether they move in and back out. It appears to be like I said, a flux of movement and rather dynamic situation. Here is a list of the 20 fish species that are found in the Middle Rio Grande. I've numbered them from 1 to 20, and then I've identified them by species code and then by species. Across the top, the 4 columns to the right are the fish that were caught in the main stem as part of population monitoring by Rob Dudley and others in 2016 and 2017. The 2 columns on the right are the fish that we caught in fyke nets simultaneous to that sampling. So this is primarily during May and June in 2016 and 2017. Note again the proportions, or large proportions of silvery minnow in the main stem in both of those years, and then the proportions, lower proportions in the floodplains. So they seem to, the fish may just be using them, periodically, moving in and out of them. Again, that's still some information that we need to get a better handle on. The one thing that called my attention here is the red shiner. Red shiner is native to the Rio Grande, but it is also one of the most predaceous species on larval fish that is in these western rivers, and that's work done by Jack Rupert and Bob Muth out of Colorado State University. And in fact, in the upper Colorado River Basin, there was a time when we were trying to actually remove red shiners. They're not native to the Colorado River, remove them as predators, but we gave that up as futile because of the large numbers that were moving back in. And so you see that if you look at floodplains generally, you can see that almost a full suite of fish that are found in the Middle Rio Grande are used floodplains, and the check marks show the 13 species that we found as larvae or young in the floodplain. So it's pretty extensive use of these floodplains for sure. We've got 2 publications, one that came out about a year ago and one that is in press right now. Companion papers with the Journal of Ecohydrology, where we describe more specifically a lot of these findings, and I'll get these out to the program so that you can circulate these as soon as this second one comes out. Using principal components analysis, we found that there are principally 4 factors that drive the location of larvae in these floodplains: depth, velocity, temperature, and their proximity to near-shore situations. And this is kind of an interesting scenario, because what we're seeing is, and many of you have noticed that, in the springtime when you have floodplain inundation, quiet areas, you see this bathtub ring, right? This kind of band of green and golden. And that band of green and gold is a community of algae and diatoms. The diatoms can be a golden sheen or a brownish sheen. Diatoms contain a large amount of lipids or fats, and the fish really consume these. When the silvery minnow is first hatched, they're about 4 or 5 millimeters long. They're tiny. Their mouth becomes functional after about 3 or 4 days. And then they start feeding on very tiny things like algae and diatoms. And then they switch to rotifers and copepods, and then larger cladocerans and so on. And so a lot of that use in those floodplain areas and their presence in those areas is clearly driven by the availability of food. There are a couple of issues that we still have not explored fully. You see in the center photo 3 silvery minnow, or 3 larvae. They turn out to be silvery minnow, but there's 3 larvae here, and there's a tadpole over here, which I label as bullfrog. It may not be. But nevertheless, we know that tadpoles are also voracious consumers of small fish. The extent of predation in these floodplains is unknown. We've tried to develop some survival curves on the silvery minnow. The survival is pretty low, as you might expect in these floodplains. So that's one question we still have. The other one is relative to the productivity of these floodplains. We recognize, and from studies around the world, it's recognized that floodplains that inundate periodically have an egg bank. They basically, when they dry, there are eggs of especially macroinvertebrates and insects that remain, and then when the area inundates the next year, of course, they hatch, and you have a huge pulse of productivity. When you dig out a restored floodplain, you're digging out fresh soil, so it doesn't have the egg bank. We don't know right now what effect that has on productivity. So productivity and predation right now are two questions that we still aren't sure about with respect to these floodplains. And so in summary, there is a growing body of information about the use of floodplains by Rio Grande silvery minnow. It goes back to the work that Mickey Porter and Tamara Masong did, where they found that restored floodplains acted a lot like natural floodplains, and in training Rio Grande silvery minnow eggs. The work that Allison Peace did as part of her master's thesis, the work that Mike Hatch and Eric Gonzalez did, where they were the first to report the predominance of silvery minnow, especially adults, in floodplains, and surmised that there was spawning taking place in or around these floodplains. Hugo Magana, of course, did some really good work with both habitat and then also with food preference, and found, in fact, under laboratory studies, that one of the favorite foods of the silvery minnow, the small silvery minnow, was in fact Nishia, which is one of the species of diatoms. And then Eric again did some more work in 2012, 2014, 2 publications there. And then Allison Hudson and Douglas Tave out of the Los Lunas silvery minnow refugium, managed by the Interstate Stream Commission, did some fantastic work in a controlled outdoor environment where they allowed silvery minnow to spawn in that area, and the movements of fish, the adults and the larvae, really closely parallel what we're seeing in the wild. So that was a great experiment for us to be able to see more specifically what happens under controlled conditions. And then, like I said, we have a paper where we published a year ago on the managed flow of 2016, and then one that we're that's just in press right now on some of this work that we're doing in floodplains with the ISC. Okay, so, you know, many people have been involved in this work. We thank everybody for all their contributions, their ideas, their help in the field. Steve Zipper, like I said, has been our leader in the field, and he's done a great job. He's also done some aging of larval silvery minnow using otolith work, and he's in the process of publishing that information also. And so we thank everybody for all the work that you've helped us with, and thank you again for this opportunity, Debbie Lee and Catherine.